Hello, John Hay. Miss Kirkness here, and I am going to read with you today Chapter 2 of City of Ember. So, fourth graders, at this time, you are going to need your reader's response page in order to complete the assignment that goes along with the read aloud. Miss Shannon read Part 1. I'm going to pick up where she left off. A Message to the Mayor, Chapter 2. Lina often took different routes between school and home, sometimes just for variety. She'd go all the way around Sparkswallow Square or way up by the shoe repair shops of Livery Street. But today she took the shortest route because she was eager to get home and tell her news. She ran fast and easily through the streets of Ember. Every corner, every alley, every building was familiar to her. She always knew where she was, though most streets looked more or less the same. All of them were lined with old two-story stone buildings, the wood of their window frames and doors long unpainted. On the street level were shops. Above the shops were the apartments where people lived. Every building at the place where the wall met the roof was equipped with a row of floodlights, big cone-shaped lamps that cast a strong yellow glare. Stone walls, lighted windows, lumpy, muffled shapes of people. Lina flew by them. Her slender legs felt immensely strong, like the wood of a bow that flexes and springs. She darted around obstacles, broken furniture left for the trash heaps or for scavengers, stoves and refrigerators that were past repair, peddlers sitting on the pavement with their wares spread out around them. She leapt over cracks and potholes. When she came to Hafter Street, she slowed a little. This street was deep in shadow. 4 of its street lamps were out and had not been fixed. For a second, Lina thought of the rumor that she had heard about the light bulbs, that some kinds were completely gone. She was used to shortages of things, everyone was, but not of light bulbs. If the bulbs for the street lamps ran out, the only lights would be inside the buildings. What would happen then? How could people find their way through the streets in the dark? Somewhere inside of her, a black worm of dread stirred. She thought about Doon's outburst in class. Could things really be as bad as he said? She didn't want to believe it. She pushed the thought away. As she turned onto Budlow Street, she sped up again, this time a line of customers waiting to get into the vegetable market, their shopping bags draped over their arms. The corner of Oliver Street, she dodged a group of washers trudging along with bags of laundry and some movers carrying away a broken table. She passed a street sweeper shoving dust around with his broom. I am so lucky, she thought, to have the job I want, and because of Doon Harrow. Of all people. When they were younger, Lina and Doon had been friends. Together, they had explored the back alleys and the dimly lit edges of the city. But in their fourth year of school, they had begun to grow apart. It started one day during the hour of free time, when the children in their class were playing on the front steps of school. I can go down there 3 steps at a time, someone would boast. I can hop down on 1 foot, someone else would say. The others would chime in. I can do a handstand against the pillar. I can leapfrog over the trash can. As soon as one child did something, all the rest would do it too, to prove they could. Lina could do it all, even when the dares got wilder. She yelled out, the wildest one of all. I can climb the light post. For a second, everyone just stared at her, but Lina dashed across the street, took off her shoes and socks, and wrapped herself around the cold metal of the pole. Pushing with her bare feet, she inched upwards and didn't get very far before she lost her grip and fell back down. The children laughed, and so did she. I didn't say I could climb to the top, she explained. I just said I could climb it. The others swarmed forward to try. Lizzie wouldn't take off her socks. Her feet were too cold, she said, so she kept sliding back. 40 pen wasn't strong enough to get more than a foot off the ground. Next came Doon. He took his shoes and socks off and placed them neatly at the foot of the pole. Then he announced in his serious way, "I am going to the top." He clasped the pole and started upward, pushing with his feet, his knees sticking out to the sides. He pulled himself upward, pushed again. He was higher now than Lina had been, but suddenly his hands slid and he came plummeting down. He landed on his bottom with his legs poking up in the air. Lina laughed. She shouldn't have. He might have been hurt. But he looked so funny that she couldn't help it. He wasn't hurt. He could have jumped up, grinned, and walked away. But Doon didn't take things lightly. When he heard Lina and the others laughing, his face darkened. His temper rose in him like hot water. "Don't you dare laugh at me," he said to Lina. "I did better than you did." That was a stupid idea anyway, a stupid idea to climb that pole. And as he was shouting, red in the face, their teacher, Mrs. Polster, came out onto the steps and saw him. She took him by the shirt collar to the school's director's office where he got a scolding he didn't think he deserved. After that day, Lina and Doon barely looked at each other when they passed in the hallway. At first, it was because they were fuming about what had happened. Doon didn't like being laughed at. Lina didn't like being shouted at. After a while, the memory of the light pole incident faded, but by then, they had got out of the habit of friendship. By the time they were 12, they knew each other only as classmates. Lina was friends with Vindy Chance, Orly Gordon, and most of all, red-headed Lizzie Biscoe, who could run almost as fast as Lina and could talk 3 times faster. Now, as Lina sped toward home, she felt immensely grateful to Doon and hoped he'd come to no harm in the pipeworks. Maybe they'd be friends again. She'd like to ask him about the pipeworks. She was curious about it. When she got to Greystone Street, she passed Clary Lane, who was probably on her way to the greenhouses. Clary waved to her and called out, "What job?" And Lina called back, "Messenger," and ran on. Lina lived in Quillam Square over the yarn shop run by her grandmother. When she got to the shop, she burst in the door and cried, "Granny, I'm a messenger!" Granny's shop had once been a tidy place where each ball of yarn and spool of thread had its spot on the cubby holes that lined the walls. All the yarn and thread came from old clothes that had gotten too shabby to be worn. Granny unraveled sweaters and picked apart dresses and jackets and pants. She wound the yarn into balls and the thread into spools, and people bought them to use in making new clothes. These days, the shop was a mess. Long loops and strands of yarn dangled out of the cubby holes, and the browns and grays and purples were mixed in with the orcs and olive greens and dark blues. Granny's customers often had to spend half an hour trying to unsnarl the rust red yarn from the mud brown, or trying to fish out the end of a thread from a tangled wad. Granny wasn't much help. Most days she just dozed behind the counter in her rocking chair. That's where she was when Lina burst in with her news. Lina saw that Granny had forgotten to knot up her hair that morning. It was standing out from her head in a wild white frizz. Granny stood up and looked puzzled. "You aren't a messenger, dear. You're a schoolgirl," she said. "But Granny, today was assignment day. I got my job and I'm a messenger." Granny's eyes lit up and she slapped her hand down on the counter. "I remember," she cried. "Messenger, that's a grand job. You'll be good at it." Lina's little sister toddled out from behind the counter on unsteady legs. She had a round face and round brown eyes. At the top of her head was a sprig of brown hair tied up with a scrap of yarn. She grabbed onto Lina's knees. "Weena, whina, whina," she cried. Lina bent over and took the child's hand. "Poppy, your big sister got a job. Got a good job. Are you happy, Poppy? Are you proud of me?" Poppy said something that sounded like, "Hoppy, hoppy, hoppy." Lina laughed, hoisting her up and dancing around with her in the shop. Lina loved her little sister so much that it was like an ache under her ribs. The baby and Granny were all the family she had now. 2 years ago, when the coughing sickness was raging through the city again, her father had died. Some months later, her mother, giving birth to Poppy, had died too. Lina missed her parents with an ache that was as strong as what she felt for Poppy. Only it was a hollow feeling instead of a full one. "When do you start?" asked Granny. "Tomorrow," said Lina. "I report to the messenger station at 8 o'clock. You'll be a famous messenger," said Granny. "Fast and famous." Taking Poppy with her, Lina went out of the shop and climbed the stairs to their apartment. It was a small apartment, only 4 rooms, but there was enough stuff in it to fill 20. There were things that had belonged to Lina's parents, her grandparents, and even their grandparents. Old, broken, cracked things that had been patched and repaired dozens or hundreds of times. People in Ember rarely threw anything away. They made the best possible use of what they had. In Lina's apartment, layers of worn rugs and carpet covered the floor, making it soft but uneven underfoot. Against one wall squatted a sagging couch with round wooden balls for legs, and on the couch were blankets and pillows, so many that you had to toss some of them on the floor because you could. There were blankets and pillows, so many that you had to toss some on the floor before you could sit down. Against the opposite wall stood 2 wobbly tables that held a clutter of plates and bottles, cups and bowls, unmatching forks and spoons, little piles of scrap paper, bits of string wound up in untidy wads, and a few stubby pencils. There were 4 lamps, 2 tall ones that stood on the floor and 2 short ones that stood on tables, and in uneven lines up near the ceiling were hooks that held coats and shawls and nightgowns and sweaters, shelves that held pots and pans, jars with unreadable labels, and boxes of buttons and pins and tacks. Where there were no shelves, the walls had been decorated with things of beauty: a label from a can of peaches, a few dried yellow squash flowers, a strip of faded but still pretty purple cloth. There were drawings, too. Lina had done the drawings out of her imagination. They showed a city that looked somewhat similar to Ember, except that its buildings were lighter and taller and had more windows. All right, this would be the right time to pause and do the first activity on your reader's response page.